Welcome to the Wednesday's Word Podcast, a ministry of Princeton Pike Church in Hamilton, Ohio.
Fellow Christians, we need to disciple each other in financial stewardship, whether that be in small groups, Sunday school classes, or even these last few Wednesday nights, just the opportunity to discuss it. So in wrapping up these 3 weeks of teaching, what I wanted to focus on tonight was the topics of debt and then passing on the importance of tithing and giving to that next generation of those coming up behind us. And those who have learned the hard way about the bondage of debt need to warn others. It's just like any other witnessing that you can do. If you've got a story to tell that can help others and it concerns debt, you need to do that. And young believers need to hear their elders tell about how God has blessed them as a result of that sound biblical stewardship. For those of you that were in here on a Sunday morning several weeks ago, I guess you got to see our son Josh's testimony. And the thing that struck me when I watched it was I thought that we had just ingrained in him over the years just the importance of tithing and the blessings that he's seen us give. But each time I went back and watched that, the thing that struck me was the one word that he used was that it was drilled into his head. And I never thought that we were drilling it into his head, but I guess that was the perception that he had. But I can stand here and tell you today, and it's a blessing to be able to watch him pay his tithe every time he gets paid. It's something that really is a blessing. So why is the topic of debt so important? For many people, debt is the rule and it's no longer the exception. If you go back 100 or so years ago, debt was regarded as an earned privilege for the few. Now it seems like it's just an inalienable right for all of us. Did you ever stop and think why banks and credit cards are constantly bombarding us with information on debt? And the one that really irks me, if you will, is the one I hear on the radio all the time, just telling people to go pull all the equity out of your house for whatever reason. And it's just going to lead people to go deeper in debt. And the reason that they do that is they are going to profit from our debt. They are not helping us out at all. They are helping themselves out. And if you stop and think about it, you ever wonder why a credit card statement shows a $500 balance, only shows a minimum payment due of $35? It's because that's all they want you to pay. They want that to compound and they want that to grow. So you can just keep paying them more and more interest. And I thought about what Justin talked about Sunday morning when I was thinking about this. And the word that he used was counterfeit. And that's what they're hitting us with. They're hitting us with a counterfeit perception of where they want us to be, not benefiting us at all, but benefiting them. And it just reminded me of the people, especially that I've dealt with over the years at work. As that debt compounds, it's like the old story of, putting that frog in that pot of water, and you just crank it up a degree at a time until you're boiling that frog. And I've seen so many people, when it comes to debt, do the same thing. It just slowly creeps up on them until they realize that they've gotten in so far over their heads that they can't get out. And what it made me think of in thinking of that counterfeit was the bug zappers. How those lights that emit to just attract those bugs. And that's what all these commercials do, getting us to go spend money that we don't have, is they're just drawing you in and they're going to get you in there, and then boom, next thing you know, zap, they've got you, just like they've got those bugs. So their philosophy is, if you've got no cash, no problem. Just go get you some plastic. That'll take care of all of your problems. Now, the Bible does not absolutely forbid debt, because it's almost impossible these days to buy a car or a house without accumulating some type of debt, but it does issue strong cautions concerning it. Proverbs 22:7 tells us that debt is servitude. The rich rules over the poor, and the borrower is servant to the lender. So you accumulate all that debt, you're just beholden to somebody else, and that's the person that's holding that debt over your head. So what should we ask ourselves before going into debt? This was a decision that Robin and I made a long time ago, and if you go back to, once again, I reiterate, to in her video testimony when we started tithing, right after we got married and we both changed jobs, we were rolling coins to make ends meet. But we made a decision early on that if we couldn't pay cash for it, we weren't going to buy it. And in those early years, that was a struggle. We went a long time without stuff for that very reason. I mean, we were both packing lunches every day to work because we couldn't afford to go out and eat. But then I look back upon it, as I mentioned last week, and just how much we've been blessed when we started giving to Him first and giving to ourselves second. So before we incur debt, we should ask ourselves some basic spiritual questions. Is the fact that I don't have the resources to pay cash for something God's way of telling me it isn't His will for me to have it? Or is it possible that it may have been God's will, but previous bad choices have put me in a position where it's no longer affordable? And I think about a certain gentleman that I knew several years ago at work, that he insisted he needed to have a new Corvette. Couldn't afford a new Corvette, but by golly, he was going to get himself a new Corvette. So what did he do? He pulled all the money for the Corvette out of his 401k at work, thinking I'm just going to repay it over time. I'm paying the interest back to myself. Well, he ended up losing his job before he got the Corvette paid off. And if any of you have ever been in that situation, what happens is, if he's going to get access to his money, he has to take a distribution from that 401k, pay the taxes on it, pay the penalties on it, which he ended up doing, and it ended up costing him probably 1.5 times to pay off that Corvette of what the original purchase price was. And then he ended up selling it, I think 5 or 6 years later, when he got tired of driving it around. So the thing I think about is, wouldn't I do better to learn God's lesson by forgoing it until, by either His provision and my diligence, I save enough money to buy it? Unfortunately, we are living in a time where those questions just don't get asked. I would describe that as the debt mentality, and that's just a distorted perspective that involves invalid assumptions, such as, we need more than God has given us. God doesn't know best what our needs are. God has failed to provide for our needs, forcing us to take matters into our own hands. And finally, if God doesn't come through the way that we think He should, we can find another way. But does not He tell us in Hebrews 13:5, let your conversation be without covetousness, and be content with such things as you have. For He hath said, I will never leave thee or forsake thee. In Philippians 4:11, not that I speak in respect of want, for I have learned in whatsoever state I am, therefore to be content. So just be content where we are. The next thing I see, and one of the reasons that people aren't content to live where they are, and number 4 talks about, have you learned how to set a budget and live on it? Proverbs 27:23 and 24 says, be diligent to know the state of your flocks and attend to your herds, for riches are not forever, nor does a crown endure to all generations. God is telling us here to know what your assets are and to know where they go. 2 practical steps that anybody can make is to record your expenditures and making a budget. Something I've done since Robin and I have been married, much to her chagrin, is I've kept a monthly budget for going on 30 years. And somewhere in our house are spiral-bound index cards that I can tell you how much we spent in any given month, anytime in the last 28 years. That's just something I did that worked for us. I think it worked more for me than it did for her, but it got us to where we are. But it's a process that takes a lot of work and effort if you're going to do something like that. And most people just don't want to put the time and effort into doing something like that. The average household debt, I've looked up some statistics while I was getting ready for this, just to give you an idea how debt really plays in and is a hindrance to what God would have us to do when it comes to our tithing and our giving. The average household debt for 2024 was $105,000. The average credit card debt was $6,730. Total consumer debt in this country was $18.036 trillion. That was a record high to end a year, but that's only half of the $36 trillion that our government's in debt. So hopefully, not making a political statement here, but hopefully with DOGE and what they're doing, if they can get our government in line, hopefully that's a good lesson for all of us to be able to balance our budgets and watch what we're spending. But just so you can conceptualize, because it's hard to fathom, and I've sat down and tried it multiple times, just to figure out how much money $36 trillion is. But if you had 1 million seconds, that's 11 and a half days. 1 billion seconds is 32 years. And 1 trillion seconds is 32,000 years. To me, it's unfathomable how we've got to where we are today when it comes to debt with no end in sight, in my opinion. So that takes us to the second area of discussion for tonight is how do we pass on, if we're going to buy into this and we're going to do what God tells us to do, to be tithers and givers, how do we pass that on? So number 5 talks about teaching children how to manage God's money and possessions. Proverbs 22:6 tells us, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Children imitate everything that we do, whether important or unimportant, healthy or unhealthy. Sometimes our kids will fail to listen to us, but rarely will they fail to imitate us. And I thought about an example, and it's actually our kids are more attentive than we give them credit for. They see things, we don't think they see things, we don't think they hear things, but they are picking up on everything. And the one example, I got a little bit off topic, but I think it's a precursor into where Pastor is going to go with his messages on the power of the tongue, was a gentleman took his 7-year-old daughter to work on Take Your Kid to Work Day, I guess is the name of it. So he walked in and he's taking her around and he's introducing her to all of the people that he works with. And all of a sudden she just breaks down crying hysterically. And he can't figure out what's wrong with her. And he's like, honey, what's the matter? And she's like, Daddy, where's all the clowns you told me you worked with? So kids pick up on what we say and what we do. And that's a perfect, I hope I didn't steal one of your examples for your teaching. So, but they know, they pay attention to us. And even if it has to be drilled into their heads over 24 years, I guess that's a good thing. So how can we help our children become more generous givers? Well, one thing in Deuteronomy 6:5, it says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. But then in Deuteronomy 6:7, Moses told them to teach that diligently to their children and talk of them when you sit in your house. So if you have no other reason for giving, then doing it for your children would be reason enough. I mean, breaking the bonds of materialism that we covered in the first class here will prove to be one of the greatest gifts you can give your children. Children who are not taught to give are hamstrung in their ability to live for Christ. Remember, Jesus taught us in Matthew 6:21 that our hearts follow whatever we treasure. And if kids grow up seeing that what you treasure is following Christ and his example and what he wants you to do when it comes to tithing and giving, then that's just going to be a blessing for them as they get on later in life. Which leads us to treasure principle number 2, which is my heart always go where I put God's money. I don't know how many times I've heard it preached over the years. You want to find where a person's heart and attention is at? Scroll through their checkbook. And now I think maybe today it's scroll through their credit card statement, because I guess me and Jeff are probably the few left that actually write checks. Everybody else just uses a bank card. But nothing will interfere more with our children's relationship with God, or even prevent them from having a relationship with him, than if they're living a life that's centered on things. Our greatest legacy to our children is to help them develop their spiritual lives, their hearts for God. Although many parents seem that they just want to leave this big inheritance to their kids, I think that does more damage than good. They can pass on this legacy to their children of giving that they can then pass on to their children's children. And if you stop and think about it, provided that the Lord doesn't come back before then, over the next 20 years, it's projected that there will be about $90 trillion that will be transferred from the baby boomers to the millennials. So you think if the baby boomers can teach the millennials the importance of tithing and giving, what we can do for the kingdom of God with all of that money? And it can just be generations that can have an eternal impact that can result from our simple acts of faithful stewardship. For we are stewards not just of God's money, but of the children that he entrusts to our care. I recently shared with my kids, I had bought and read a book that's called How to Die with Zero. And the first thing that came across Josh's face was I was going to go spend his entire inheritance. But that wasn't the premise of the book. The premise of the book was, what are you willing to sacrifice? Is it worth working those extra 5 years to save up more money when possibly you're giving up time with your family? You're giving up 5 years of good health and retirement. You're not able to do the things that you want to do. So that it just really convinced me that there's a lot of things that we can do for the kingdom of God with our assets than just accumulating and hoarding more things that are just going to go away. Going to finish up a little, and I'm not done yet, so don't get excited. We're not going to be that early this week. But as far as what we can do for our kids, that is it. We just have to instill in them the importance of what all of this means to us. And I think of what we've been able to share with our kids, and I know there's many other people in here that share with your kids the benefits and the blessings of tithing. But just a couple of questions for you to ponder, and that would be, Jesus, how can I better communicate with and pray with my spouse and children so we can walk together down this wonderful road of giving? And what am I doing and what should I be doing to train the children in my sphere of influence to be regular, joyful, and generous givers? And then if I am a giver, whom have I been teaching and mentoring in giving? As I mentioned a few minutes ago, you can witness the salvation aspect of your walk. You can also witness the blessings of tithing and giving in your walk to the people that you come in contact with. And treasure principle number 3 talks about heaven and the future new earth, not this fallen earth, is my home. And something else that Justin preached Sunday that really stuck with me was he was talking about the difference between wanting to and having to. And I think if you're here and you're not a tither and you're not a conscience giver, I want to tell you to just give it a try. I think the more that you do it, it really makes you want to do it more. But then the more that it makes you want to, you're going to get to the point, as I mentioned, I think it was last week, that want to is going to morph into a have to. When you see the blessings of what he's going to do, and as I mentioned before, I cannot imagine keeping that first 10% from him. I just can't imagine what my life would be like. I would be scared to death to go to sleep and close my eyes if that's what I was doing. So if you sense that God's leading you, if you're here tonight, and that may be you, if he's leading you either into a new commitment to giving, whether that be you're not tithing and you want to start tithing, or you're a tither but you feel like there's maybe more that you can do when it comes to giving, then I want to leave you, once again, we're not leaving yet, so I got more to go, but I want to give you these 6 steps to follow. And number 1 is, I affirm God's full ownership of me and everything entrusted to me. I recognize that my money and possessions are his. Number 2 is, I will set aside the first fruits, starting with at least 10% of all I receive, treating it as belonging exclusively to the Lord. Number 3, out of the remaining treasures that God entrusts to me, I will seek to make generous free will gifts. Number 4 is, I ask God to teach me to give sacrificially to his purposes. We've talked about spending time with him, spending time in the Word. That will allow him to show you where he wants you to give and for which of his purposes that he wants you to give. I commit myself to avoiding indebtedness so that I don't tie up his funds and therefore have greater freedom to follow the Spirit's prompting to give. Number 5 is recognizing that I cannot take earthly treasures from this world. I will ask for his direction for what to do and where to give his money. And number 6, I ask him to help me share these principles so others, as I have, can experience present joy and future rewards. And I think that's it. I think if we just go out and we share with people, I can't say it enough, the benefits of tithing and giving that Robin and I have seen in our lives over these last nearly 30 years. It's incomprehensible. If somebody would have told me that nearly 30 years ago, I would have never believed it. So we've gone through, we've talked about all this. We've talked about all of the 6 treasure principles in order. But just to reiterate what those are, number 1 is God owns everything. I'm just his money manager. Number 2, my heart always go where I put God's money. Number 3 is heaven and the future new earth that we just talked about, not this fallen earth as my home. Number 4, I should live not for the dot, but live for the line, live for eternity, not this present minuscule amount of time that we're going to spend on this planet. Number 5, giving is the only antidote to materialism. When we moved to our home where we're at now, just the amount of stuff that we got rid of just blew me away. The stuff that we had accumulated for years and for no reason. And to make it even worse, once we got moved in, and we've been there for 6 years, now we're going through and getting rid of stuff that we drug with us from one house to the other. And just getting to that point where we're just giving all this stuff away. I shared with Pastor the other day that in giving, we give a lot to the Vietnam vets. And I was telling him the other day that after the thing on Saturday that I went through and I cleaned out my closet a little bit. I'm down from 65 pairs of running shoes to 59 because I got rid of some. So we're making progress. That is 10% that I got rid of. There you go. Never thought about that. I just went through and started chucking. But God prospers me not to raise my standard of living, but to raise my standard of giving and what we can do. And I came across this the other day, and it said, the truth is that God has a unique plan for each of us, shaped by our individual experiences. He will use the gifts, talents, and opportunities he has provided throughout our lives to help us find peace and fulfillment in him. Not anything else, just him. If you find that peace and fulfillment in him, everything else will take care of itself. Seek ye first the kingdom of God. And then the incredible thing is that the more we rest in his presence, the more we realize that is all we need. He will fill in any gaps that we think we have. They're not there if we let him take care of everything. But for those perceived gaps that we have, let's let him fill them in a way that only he can. So the 3 weeks on the treasure principle, that pretty much covers it all. But I did want to cover a couple of other things with you. Since we've talked about tithing and giving, I thought it would only be appropriate if we go through and talk about some of the different aspects of giving. I know we've talked about this. We've done some other classes in the past in the church, but I just felt like we should really cover this at the end of what we're doing and just talk about how most people give during their lifetime. And, most of it cash. It's the most common and the easiest way for people to give. But there are other ways to do it, and a lot of people may not be aware of, and we've seen it benefit a lot of people over time. And that is with appreciated assets. And I always use the example, if you own Procter & Gamble stock, and it's now at 170, but you paid $50 for it. So if you're going to sell that stock and you're going to use it for anything, you're going to pay $120 capital gain per share when you sell it. So why not use that, gift that to the church? Nobody then ends up paying the tax on it. And then use the cash, and if you want to still own the stock, you can go out and just buy the stock back. And now you've got a higher cost basis that if you ever do sell it, you've got a whole lot less gain to deal with. Plus what we've done in the past, and I know there's several other people in the church that have done it, the church does have an account that you can gift stock to just give or pay your tithe. But what it will do, since we're not paying tax on it, it's allowed us to be able to give more than what we normally would have given, especially if we would have sold the stock, to be able to give it to the church. Another way is something that's called a qualified charitable deduction. And that would be for anybody in here that's over 70 and a half. If you've got IRA assets and you're having to take that required minimum distribution every year from that IRA, if you have it paid directly to a charity, in this case, if you have that paid directly to the church, then that does not get included on your income for the year. So that has several benefits. If you just take the distribution, let's say you've got to take $10,000 out of your IRA, now you've got that $10,000 that you're reporting as income along with your other income. That may possibly push you up into a higher tax bracket. It may make more of your Social Security taxable. So if you gift it directly to the church, you can avoid all of that and not by adding it into your income. Giving away at passing. Something Robin and I have talked about is setting it up to you leave stuff to the church in your will. name the church as a 10% beneficiary on your accounts. Give you that one last opportunity to pay tithe before you go on to the great beyond. But there's a lot of things that you can do in that regard to set it up and to be able to pass that money on. There are a lot of other advanced strategies. We won't get into those tonight because they get a little bit complicated, but there's such things as a charitable remainder trust, where you can set up a trust where you can draw income off of it, but upon your death, then the remainder goes to the charity. There's a charitable lead trust where the money goes to, in this case, if you set it up, the money could come to Princeton Pike, but then upon your death, it would then pass on to your heirs, whatever balance is left. There's charitable gift annuities, there's donor advised funds. There's a lot of things that you can do to be able to give as part of an estate plan to the church. The one thing I wanted to do tonight that's just a little bit different in covering all this stuff, I wanted to leave a few minutes at the end. One was to see if anybody had any questions on anything that we've covered over the last 3 weeks. I would think somebody might have a question or two. If not, then okay. Well, if there are no questions, I guess I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoy this podcast, please take a moment to subscribe and share. We really appreciate it. To learn more about Princeton Pike Church, please visit www.ppcog.com.